and love, everybody. Ringo here. Beautiful day in LA.
So, it was good to be able to kind of get it out in a song.
The whole, origin of where we're all coming from.
I'm prepared for death because I don't believe in it. I think it's just getting out of one car and getting into another.
Hi, and hey, Beatle fans, and welcome to Talk More Talk, a solo Beatles videocast. This is a bi-weekly show in which we talk about, for the most part, the solo careers of the Beatles, without a doubt the most successful solo careers of any artist coming from a previous band. I'm Ken Michaels. I'm one of the four regular co-hosts of this show, known for my syndicated Beatles radio program called Every Little Thing, also for another talk show podcast called Things We Said Today. Hopefully you know me for those shows as well. And I'm being joined by my esteemed colleagues here on the show. First of all, we have the queen of Beatles media, who has written, yes, we can bow in front of her. I thought you were gonna have your hat.
I know. I forgot the hat.
I was all prepared to call you the mini Pearl in the Beatles world. But we, of course, know Kit for all of our work with Beatle Fan, the book Songs Who Are Singing Guided Tours to the Beatles' Lesser Works, Michael Jackson FAQ, and we welcome Kit O'Toole to the show. Hi, Kit.
Hello, Ken. Hello, guys. And hello, everybody watching or listening out there.
Also, we have one of the deans at Monmouth University who has written a number of books on the Beatles, including the Beatles Encyclopedia, and 2 books on George Martin, which I think Tom is ready to show to everybody, I think. Sound Pictures, which is the most recent. And there's also the first one called Maximum Volume. You have that one there, Tom?
No.
Oh, sorry.
The second volume is so heavy. I can't. I mean, this is
okay.
2 would be too much.
Actually, our topic on the show revolves around George Martin, and who better to ask than the author of those 2 books on George Martin? Hello, Ken. How you doing?
Hey, everybody. It's good to see you tonight.
And also we have Tom Hunyady, who you know for the solo McCartney podcast called Two Legs that he co-hosts with David Gargolino. Hello, Tom. How are you?
Hello, Ken. And Queen. Yes.
I greet all my subjects.
I am not worthy. Yeah.
We've got to have a special service at the very beginning to bow down in front of God, I think.
Right.
So on the show tonight, we figured that, hey, we've had Ken Womack here since the very beginning. This is our 20th show. He's written these 2 books on George Martin. We haven't talked to him about his work on George Martin. And in specifically, we'll be talking about George Martin's work with the solo Beatles. Of course, we can throw in anything on the Beatles as a group as well, and maybe some of the other artists that George Martin produced. And we'll get to that in just a moment. We do have Tom to give us his own review of seeing Paul McCartney live, which we will do in just a few moments. And we'll briefly talk about the film Yesterday, which we're probably going to go in more detail on our next show. But first, we'll start with the latest in Beatle news. And actually, it's not nearly as much as what we've had in the past, but here's what I got for you. First of all, Paul McCartney's show on June 28th at the T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas included a special guest that he brought on stage, that being Steven Tyler. And the 2 of them did Helter Skelter together, which you can now watch on YouTube. Paul has just made available online a new remix for his song Nothing for Free, which is produced by Chris Holmes. And I know that we posted it on our Facebook page, I believe. Yes. Have you guys heard it?
Yeah.
Yes, I have.
Okay. I don't think it offers anything special. I think it It's one thing I would have left alone. I thought that song was brilliant enough. I mean, I don't know if it needed to be, toyed around with, but doesn't surprise me that there's a remix of that song out. So just as long as we don't get the remix version of Egypt Station, I'm okay with it.
I kind of agree with you. Ken?
Yeah, I kind of agree too. I think I mean, it just, there isn't that much difference to it. I mean, it's just like kind of a stronger beat. And I like some of the remixes that Paul has had different DJs do. I mean, some of them have been very creative and a lot of fun. But yeah, this one, and I know Chris Holmes, of course, has worked with him for over many years. He does all the mixing, like half an hour before the show starts, they play this, mix of all this different hits. And it's a lot of fun. I mean, I enjoy listening to those. But yeah, this one, I just thought, I was expecting a little more. And as you said, Tom, I think it didn't really need it anyway. It's such a great song on its own.
Mm. Yeah, Ken, have you heard it?
I have not. But, I defer to the Queen.
Well, you'll have to hear it. I mean, see what you think. As I said, I just personally didn't think it added that much to to an already strong track.
The only difference that I heard was that it sounded like it was sped up, just a little bit faster than the original version, and that is one of my favorite songs from the Egypt Station sessions, which originally was a bonus track on the Target version, and then on the Explorers edition and Travelers edition. Really good song that he wrote with Ryan Tedder. The film yesterday, which we'll talk about very briefly, did well at the box office, coming in as the #3 movie over the weekend, bringing in $17 million behind Toy Story 4 and Annabelle Comes Home. Also, Ringo Starr will continue his annual Peace and Love birthday celebration this year, which he's been doing every year now since 2008, returning to the Capitol Records Tower in LA on his birthday, July the 7th. Ringo will be joined with a star-studded cast of classic rockers and other celebrities. Those expected to attend will be Edgar Winter, Ben Montench, Sheila E., Nils Lofgren, T-Bone Burnett, Jim Keltner, Greg Bissonette, David Lynch, Ed Begley Jr., Richard Lewis, and of course, wife Barbara Bach. There'll be a photo op at 10:45 in the morning and performances of Ringo songs at 11. At 12 noon, Ringo will do what he's been doing, like I said, since 2008, saying the words peace and love, hoping everyone around the world will say it along with him. And he has said if we all say it or think it together, perhaps we'll all achieve it. Okay?
Why not?
Yoko Ono was among the celebrities showing their support for NYC Pride Week. A photo of her with her arms outstretched on the streets of New York has been shown online with Yoko's message, "Happy World Pride, New York City. This is our world, and it's beautiful. I want to survive together. I see rainbows. I see tomorrow. I see us sending rainbow. Rainbow love. Love, Yoko." So, as always, Yoko involved.
And I give her a lot of credit because, it's a bit of a push for her to do some of these things now. I mean, she's, a bit older now and but she still does it. I mean, she's still out there showing that, how that she's still relevant, that she still cares about these issues. And I give her a lot of credit.
Absolutely. 86 years old, and she's still out there making her presence known. Also, Jeff Lynne kicked off his North American tour. This is back on June the 20th with a concert of 20 songs with ELO. That has been the repertoire. And 8 songs in, he welcomed the opening act, Danny Harrison, who sang the Traveling Wilburys' favorite, Handle with Care, with Jeff. And Danny sang George's part in the song. And if you've seen this online, and I think there have been a few videos of this, I just get chills. Danny singing George's part. And also, in case you haven't heard about this, not only is Danny the opening act, but he has posted online a 1-hour performance of him and his band called In Para Live, with songs from his album In Parallel. So if you can't make it to the concert with Jeff Lynne and Danny, well, you can observe Danny performing with his band in this video. Also, if you're a fan of the band Yes, They have been touring with Asia, also John Lodge and Carl Palmer. As part of their encores, they've been doing John Lennon's song Imagine. But what makes this special, as many fans know, Alan White, the drummer of Yes, played on the song Imagine and on the Imagine sessions. So they actually have a video from Imagine being shown behind the band as they're playing this, and it looks like it's part of Above Us Only Sky. So you see the band playing, and you see an early Alan White while Alan White is performing with Yes Now, as well as John and George Harrison's in it, and Klaus Voormann. So it's really cool that this is one of their encores, and they're presenting it this way.
Nice.
And finally, there's a brand new 4-part magazine on the history of the Beatles. It's called The Beatle Years, being released. The first volume just came out, and the front cover reads, From Skiffle Boom to the Birth of Beatlemania, How 4 Musicians Forged a Sound That Was as Innovative as it was inspirational. The series celebrates the life, legacy, and music of the Fab Four, and this first issue has 134 pages. The second volume will be coming out in December for those of you that collect that kind of thing. All right. Anything else you guys might have to add that you might know about as far as what's going on news-wise?
Not that I can think of. Ken, what do you know?
That was pretty thorough there, Ken Michaels.
Okay. Have we lost Tom? Because I don't see him on
he popped out. Yeah, Tom's going to be doing this a bit tonight. He's apparently the whole Arizona, like I don't know if it's Phoenix area, and I've been having a lot of internet problems. So he's going to be kind of popping in and out during the evening as of connection stuff. So that I think he's coming back. Hang on just a second. All right, I think he's back. All right, let's welcome back the man, Tom. He's back.
There he is.
I knew this was going to happen. Thanks.
Yep, we said that. Yeah, we said technical difficulties.
Anyways, my dreams were my ticket out.
But you're back just in time.
Yeah. Anyway,
so
sorry about that.
Your timing couldn't be perfect.
Right. Awesome.
It's now time for you to talk about this concert that you attended.
Great.
With Mr. McCartney. What'd you think?
Great. Another magical night. This was probably my favorite of the 3 times that I've seen him. We criticize him from time to time for his set list and his voice, but as soon as that show starts, all that stuff just goes out the window for me. It's just no matter how many times we hear the same songs, it just doesn't matter. As soon as that show starts, everybody's having fun, and that fun is contagious, and it's just a really good time. And he actually was in pretty fine voice for this performance, but I gotta say, the band does do a good job with kind of hiding the vocal, his vocals a little bit with their backing vocals. So, but all in all, it was great. But I gotta tell you, three words: horns, horns, and horns. It was just the magical part of the show. And it really made the show pop, and I'm really glad that he brought the horns back. And it's unfortunate that you guys probably on the East Coast won't get to see it, because I don't think he's gonna do any shows on the East Coast for this tour, because it's almost over with. But
Oh, really?
But maybe. Well, yeah, it's almost over. Last show's in Los Angeles here in a couple days, I think, and then that's it. Yeah. So he didn't schedule any New York shows or anything like that, or New Jersey.
Not at all.
Yeah. So who knows if this is going to be it for the year. Because the tickets for my show went on sale last September, so they were 10 months before the concert. So if he was to do shows at the rest of this year, he probably would have already, or they probably would have announced it already. But
Yep, he's freezing.
Oh, he's freezing.
I'm glad he got that part out about the horns before.
It sounded like the horns are there.
Yeah,
I think so.
Yeah. He's absolutely right, though. The horns were just phenomenal. I mean, I hope he keeps that for tours, the however many tours he's going to be doing. That was such an addition. Oh, I think Tom. Okay, Tom, you're moving again. All right.
Okay, all right, good. But anyways, the set list, he did change up a couple songs. I thought the 3 songs from Egypt Station played really well. Especially For You, I thought was amazing, and then Who Cares worked really well live too. I love it when Rusty did the feedback up against the speaker. That was really cool for the beginning of Who Cares. And the horns for Come On to Me were awesome. When he does Let Me Roll It, I think, which was the 3rd or 4th song, the horns were in the I think it's stage right. They were in the crowd up on the upper deck, so they were kind of in working in with the crowd. That was pretty cool. And then Junior's Farm, one of my top 5 favorite Paul songs, and it was great to see him do that live. I had never seen him do that live. And the same with Let Him In. He never did Let Him In on the 2 other shows that I saw him. So that was really cool. And then speaking of Wings, it's really funny because then when he got to 1985, that's when he goes, "This is for the Wings fans." And I thought he did all these other great Wings songs. And he, when you guys were a trio to say, this is for the Wings fans. It was really just odd. But if our buddy Don is here, Don Maley, who is a fan of this show and Two Legs, and he flew down from Portland, Oregon to hang out and watch the show down here in Phoenix. So it was cool hanging out with him and getting to meet him finally. And 3-hour show. The horns, I'll tell you what, Golden Slumbers with the horns, magnificent.
Yep.
That was another glorious highlight of the night, was that all the pyro from Live and Let Die was great. And Kit, yes, Valentine again.
I was just about to ask you, what was the beer run song?
Yeah. And it's sad because it's a nice song, but it's just like, I don't know if people want that upbeat stuff, and I think that's when everybody was the happiest. From the show. Couple next to me was a big family from Denver. First time seeing Paul live, so that was kind of cool seeing their faces and watching them enjoy the show as well. So it was really just a special night, and I really hope he comes back. But I also hope that it slows down the touring a little too.
Yeah. In recent years, for me, part of the joy in seeing Paul or Ringo live is seeing people that have seeing them for the first time and seeing their reaction. So, when people are shocked when there's explosions during Live and Let Die, he's been doing this now since,
1975. Yeah.
Yeah. Explosions. It's like they don't know this, but.
That was a fun comment a second ago from Bernardo about the show in Dallas. I was at that one too. And and there were no horns in 1990, of course, on that tour, and the Flowers in the Dirt tour. And I remember thinking, especially about Golden Slumbers and Carry That Weight, how it was missing, the power of that orchestration.
Or Got to Get You Into My Life, or, there were so many that, that I just thought, oh, come on, bring back more. Because, seeing Rock Show, the horns on that tour were just phenomenal.
He must have saved up his money then to be able to do this for us.
It costs a lot.
It's very nice, though, that it took a few years, but he managed to save up the dollars for it. Maybe it was Egypt Station being number 1 that helped us go back to that place. That's really awesome.
Who knows?
If we bring it back to number 1, maybe he'll take an orchestra with him.
That would be, or a half orchestra probably at this point.
Yeah, right.
How did the crowd react to the new songs, Tom?
Oh yeah, For You I thought was terrific. He did a really cool thing before For You, where he just goes, "Hey, look, we know what songs you want to hear," because whenever he does like a Beatles song or a popular Wings songs, all the phones light up. And he goes, whenever he does a new song, it turns into the audience turns into a black hole. He goes, "We don't care. We're gonna do them anyways." He did For You, and the crowd went crazy. They did the video for For You in the background, which I thought was great because I love that video, and that's the video that That's what really made me really love that song, was that video. But that was great. And like I said, who cares? You know, he did a nice little, you know, intro. What he normally does is just says, you know, that the song is for, you know, there's a lot of bullying out there, especially internet bullying. So these are for the people that feel bullied. And there was a person holding a sign over here that says, you know, I'm 17 years old, but I get bullied because I'm an old soul. You know, and he had a, you know, a Sergeant Pepper outfit on, you know, and so Paul pointed him out in the crowd. So that was kind of cool.
Oh,
And,
that's nice.
yeah. And, you know, no matter, I just love the arrangement of something. I love that arrangement. I don't care how many times I see it. I still get a little emotional. And then same with here today.
That never grows
it's hard
old.
to not get emotional when you hear him do those two songs. And, and you know, he knocked it out of the park again. You know,
I'm with Joni.
I thought these songs worked. I thought these new songs worked better live than the songs from New that he played. But that's just my opinion. Maybe just because I like these songs a little bit better than the songs from New. But great time. Yeah,
Ken,
and
what were you saying?
I love the fact that he hasn't abandoned Queenie Eye. You know, Dennis Dickinson. You know,
I thought that was nice.
I wish he'd abandon it. I'm with Joni and put in silly love songs.
I'm missing Ken
agree.
Yeah,
and Womack went blank on my screen, so I can't hear him or see him.
Okay, you can pop in and out if you need to.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm with Joni. Silly love songs would be a great addition, especially with that crisp horn section. I mean, that's what makes it so fabulous.
I'm going to pop out one time, Kit, and come right back.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that was one of the highlights. So one thing I always remember from Rock Show is of silly love songs and you know, the horn section. I mean, that was really you know, a highlight. So yeah, I agree. I wish he'd bring that back too.
All right.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that he's doing Letting Go, which I mention every now and then, and Junior's Farm, which he started doing in the last few years. Always one of my favorite singles from his post Beatles career. Great rocker, should be right up there at the beginning of the show.
And he didn't do it at the show. He didn't do it. He did Save Us.
Yeah, he did. That's right.
I love that song too.
Yeah.
Anyway, but it's always a thrill to see Paul, and you know, the whole experience of taking it all in. A man who's given us all this great music, and you know, he's got such a catalog that is so rich, and just watching the reaction of people around you, that is part of the experience for me. Like I said, seeing people who are going to see Paul for the first time, which happens every time I see Paul. You think it might be the same people that I meet all the time. There's always people who have never seen him live, and for that reason, I'm just so grateful he still keeps doing this. Same with Ringo.
Yep. So, and I got Ringo in 2 months myself. So actually 2 months to the day from the Paul show. So August 26th.
I got Ringo for 2 shows like a week before that. So
awesome.
Yeah. All right. So before we talk about George Martin, we just want to briefly mention the movie Yesterday, which all of us have seen except Kit. But we were thinking that, you know, every time you see a review now online, it's like there's no spoilers here. We don't want to give the whole movie away. There is a big twist right before the end of the movie, near the end of the movie. We don't want to talk about that. Please don't post anything about that. But I can just say that I really enjoyed seeing this movie. I think some people are super critical when I look online. If you just relax and enjoy it for the entertainment value alone, I love the whole storyline behind it, but I would definitely recommend seeing it. And we are going to talk about this at length in our next show to give you guys a chance to see it, because I know many of you have still not seen it. And we figure in a few weeks, by then, if you haven't seen it, you probably won't be going anyway. So
right, yeah, three weekends should be plenty enough time for you guys to see it. So we'll start talking about it a little more freely on the next show.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's a lot of things I want to bring up, because it's one of the few movies on the Beatles that's not a documentary that I would actually go and see more than once. It's really enjoyable, you know, to that degree. Anyway, as I said, we're going to be talking about George Martin here, because we do have the professor, Ken Womack, with us, who has written a couple of books on George Martin, the most recent of which covers from from 1967 through the end of George's career. And since we are a solo Beatles video cast, most of what we'll talk about will be George Martin's work with the solo Beatles. But I would like to bring up, to start, the Beatle breakup itself. Because even though George Martin did work before the Beatles, and even other acts while he was producing the Beatles, it still must have been, in 1970, a big shock for all this to happen. And I wanted to know, based on your research, Ken, was this a very sad time for him, or was it a very liberating time for him? Because I have to imagine being the producer for the Beatles had enormous pressure to it, so many expectations, so much in record sales. Was there some relief at the time, or was it a combination of both that and sadness?
Well, Ken, it was all those things, really. He was relieved because he had really grown tired of watching them nitpick and picnic on each other in the studios, and he found that to be very depressing. And the fact that they were able to pull off Abbey Road was, to him, a great source of consolation and solace. But he was relieved, and I think he probably had a little bit of PTSD, although we didn't call it that in 1970. Not for a long time, in fact, but he was in a kind of shell-shocked way. I think the reason why he doesn't feel it acutely, though, is because in 1970, he is trying desperately to pull together the dollars to create Air London, which was Air Oxford Street at the time. And it was an enormous and very expensive undertaking to build and outfit a studio that he did not own, was renting at Piccadilly Circus in the vicinity of the tube station there. And it was a lot of pressure. But of course, for the solo years, and I include him in the solo years in a way because he was so integral, during the initial solo years, he was really working hard to make a buck. He had that terrible deal that EMI had left him with as his how do we call it? His dismissal clause, or rather his ability to exercise himself out of EMI.
Was that the one he signed in 1965?
That's right, and it really it had taken a toll because the percentages were so low.
Yes.
Yeah. And it would haunt him, of course.
Yeah.
with his first top 5 single in 1973.
Yeah, that's coming.
But he was really hustling, trying to make that work. And where I was going before, besides the exit contract, studios would really become his hits in his post-Beatle years. I mean, he made by far the most money out of operating the 3 studios that he built.
Very good. How much research did you do in finding out as much as you can about the Sentimental Journey sessions? There isn't that much that I know about it, other than the fact that George Martin was at the helm. And a very interesting aspect of that album is the fact that every single song has a different arranger to it. Did he enjoy that experience, or was he limited because every song except one that was his own arrangement had someone else doing the arrangements? What was that whole experience like for him?
I don't have a lot of new things to say about that. But I will say this, and I talk about this in the book. The problem with Sentimental Journey, and George did this more than once in his post-Beatles years, and I guess arguably during the Beatles years too, but especially when he was dealing with artists with whom he may not have been familiar in the same way. And in this case, I'm referring to the arrangers, right? He really set up a kind of classically problematic situation where he made it, I would argue, much more difficult than it needed to be, right? He was perfectly capable of arranging the songs. What he was doing was building his own kind of thought experiment on how they could approach these old standards. And when you look at it in retrospect, George had a good time making it, but like Ringo, he wasn't thrilled with the outcome. And I wonder if they were ready to do that, really, at this point. It seemed like a lark in a way. he was eager to stay in business, even at the paltry percentage he suddenly discovered he was getting for working with Ringo. He thought that he would be treated like a solo artist. Of course, Lynn Wood at EMI was quick to say, "Oh no, George, you're working under the same crummy deal we gave you with your exit agreement in 1965."
Yeah.
In that moment in post-Beatledom, they did turn over a lot of units with that record.
Yeah. Did Ringo pick the songs, or was that all George Martin or the arrangers? Or
it's a combination. He what did he used to say? I tried to pick songs my mom would like.
right.
I would leave it there. I mean, George picked some of them. George certainly picked the arrangers. And he was imagining this kind of magnificent collaboration, right? And you can see that all over his career, where he imagines these different kinds of scenarios where he brings people together.
Okay, so we're going to bounce around. I have a load of other questions, but why don't we have Kit ask the next one?
Okay. Well, first of all, I'm going to turn it to just a viewer question here. Let me put it on the screen here from Dennis Dickinson. And I'm assuming did George Martin wonder why Paul didn't work with him? I'm assuming he means, before Live and Let Die. Of course, why didn't he initially work with him when he was doing his first solo album and Wings?
Wow. I don't think he did, actually. He had plenty of work. People were lining up to work with him. He spent most of his time trying to turn the Air Oxford Street location into a successful business, and does after a few years. The problem was he took an enormous debt load to outfit the studio with really contemporary, high-quality gear. And that would be the hallmark that he would follow up in Montserrat, and later again when he built his second studio in London after Oxford Street's rent lapsed. But he was enormously busy. He had a lot of folks he was working with, several that he'd been waiting to work with for years. And I don't know that he necessarily missed that. What we do know now, of course, even though George really never discussed this until much later, was that he was orchestrating Ram. Yep. So he was involved in that project. I don't think he felt slighted necessarily. I do know he was bothered by being called out by John Lennon in 1972 and beyond, for working with, let's call them lesser known acts like Stackridge and others. When you look at that period, George is working with one different act after another. And when you listen to those records, as I have sequentially, it creates a very interesting experience. There is a lot of commonality between, all of those different acts he's working with. He's getting a lot of great new sounds, but I think he's looking for the next big thing. If you go back, many years, really before the Beatles, he's just repeating the behavior that he exhibited in the 1950s when he was looking for that fireproof act, right? That first rock act or that first skiffle act. He's just trying it all. He's sampling to see if he can find, a big winner. So I don't know that he felt slighted about Paul at all. I think he was just looking for the big one.
Well, and actually, that perfectly leads to a question I was going to ask you, Ken, which is one of I think the most fascinating aspects of Sound Pictures is George's journey of okay, how do you follow the Beatles? How do you follow with that? And it's hard act to follow. And talking about his work with it was the would-be comeback album of Tommy Steele, and how that didn't work at all. And I love this sentence you have here. It says, with Steele and clients before him like Judy Garland and Ella Fitzgerald, the producer had come to learn that late career encounters were just that, glowing opportunities and sometimes desperate efforts to recapture the contemporary musical consciousness, and more often than not, old glories. I thought that was wow. I mean, that's telling it like it is. So how do you feel like, how did George get out of that? How did he find himself again. Relaunch his career after going through this this phase of trying to figure out where he fit in that landscape.
If you look at it, he never stops doing that. I don't know that he actually learns from his own behavior. Mm-hmm. The first thing he did when he became, head of Air, was to go to New York, to go to songwriting, to go to places like the Brill Building to try to find songwriters. That's what you did in 1958 and 62.
Wow.
Yep.
So George was iterating old behaviors for a business that he and his band, the Beatles, had changed. There's a deep irony in that, if you think about it, in the fact that he was really using the wrong behaviors after he and the Beatles blow up the industry. It was very strange. And Jeff Kendall up there mentions George Martin's work with America. I would argue that working with Jeff Beck and America were examples of him being able to take acts who, I wouldn't call them retreads by any stretch, but Jeff had not seen glory for a bit, and America, after an explosive beginning when they just dominated the charts, had kind of nosedived, right? So those are great examples of George actually following his old instincts and the old pre-Beatles model, but succeeding pretty successfully. America, and I think other critics from this period would agree, was his greatest post-Beatles success in a lot of ways. He took this band and he got a lot of pleasure out of taking them back from, this scrap heap that they'd suddenly found them on, and turned them back into a successful band with Sister Golden Hair, and all those great songs. He even, this is one of my favorite tales about George, when they do that beautiful America's Greatest Hits, which was the soundtrack for any of us who remember that part of the 70s, right?
Right.
Even as young as we were, that beautiful album cover, the one with the almost the cartoonish drawing, right?
Yeah.
George went back and remixed all of their early hits like Ventura Highway that he had not originally produced. And I think in his own way, that was his method for sort of making them his own, right? He just couldn't let them be like they were. He had to put a little bit of the Martin stamp on it to have some ownership there. And they had a blast working with each other. They recorded in Hawaii, in resorts. They were everywhere. Having a lot of fun together until they got to the point where really nothing was happening anymore with America. I would argue, though, that had nothing to do with George and really the quality of the material. They were not Lennon and McCartney. No, they just weren't. They weren't churning out that kind of material, and certainly not with that kind of longevity. And they eventually part ways. But what a resuscitation effort George pulls off with those guys.
Yeah.
It's also kind of ironic that some of those songs with America sound very Beatlesque.
Absolutely.
Sister Golden Hair is like straight out of the George Harrison songbook. It starts off kind of like My Sweet Lord in a way. And Daisy Jane is so McCartney-esque. My God. It's a gorgeous tune. I can easily hear Paul singing that. Yeah, absolutely.
And maybe even more importantly, Lonely People, right?
Yeah.
Where did that come from?
Just don't look at them.
Yep.
It's interesting you brought up Ram, because I think George put a big stamp on Ram, because he did the orchestral arrangements for Uncle Albert Admiral Halsey and also Backseat of My Car.
And that's beautiful stuff.
Yeah, a lot of people point to Ram as sounding very Beatlesque. Not just because it's Paul, but I guess George Martin had a lot to do with it. And it's also kind of ironic. I don't know if I mentioned this when Red Rose Speedway came out, the box set, but only then did I even see, it has it in the notes there, that Little Lamb Dragonfly, it says George Martin orchestral arrangement. So it's from the Ram sessions, so it makes sense.
Sure does.
Yeah.
All right, Tom.
All right.
All right. Well, one of the things I love on Two Legs is talking with authors, and I love talking with you right now. But I'm a big fan of getting into why somebody's doing a project like this. Do he's done his own memoir. I mean, you've got the Produced by George documentary. How much of that did you take with you? I mean, how much was there any like grain of salt with that? Because you said he was looking for the next big thing, but if you watch Produced by George, which I just did earlier today, you said he wasn't really looking for hits. He was just more or less looking for work. I mean, so tackling maybe mistruths or things that people don't remember. I mean, how do you handle that, and where do you start this journey?
Yeah, well, I wanted to work on the books because they didn't exist, and I wanted to have that information in one place. I thought he was an interesting story. I think, like many of us in 2013, Mark Lewison provides us with valuable information that changes how we think about George, right, in useful ways. And when you start to understand those aspects of him, his mild duplicities at times, it starts to make sense when you weigh it over the course of his life. So first of all, it was a lack in the work we have at the moment. So I wanted to do it for that reason. But the real challenge was sifting through those works you describe, which often have either George buying into the Beatles' own showbiz mythology or misremembering things, sometimes having them in the wrong order. There were a couple of moments when I was writing Maximum Volume, which I will send you a copy because you're a good pal. But there were a couple of moments when I thought George had given me some great climactic ends for my chapters, right? And I was following along with with a little help from my friends. No, what's it called? All You Need Is Ears. That was the one where I found the most errors. And I had to I realized that the timeline didn't work out, so I had to sort of roll it back and find a new climax for that chapter, which wasn't hard. It's the Beatles, story at a certain point. So helping him find his space inside that story to me was very important. And I just by writing it, I learned things I couldn't have imagined about him.
Wow.
Okay. Can we jump into the next decade? Since there's so much here to talk about, but how did George Martin find working on what I call the trilogy of Tug of War, Pipes of Peace, and Give My Regards to Broad Street? And also, do you have any information to explain, because we've been given different answers through the years about why Wings really ended. And I've heard that George Martin felt that Paul should be working with, superior musicians or people of his caliber. I've heard that kind of an explanation. I don't know if it was just a matter of Paul getting tired of the band lineup or the experience of the drug bust in Japan. Is there any information you have about that and what George Martin's influence might have been as far as making it a solo McCartney album? Because they did rehearse songs from Tug of War when they were in Wings towards the end.
They absolutely did. I've heard so many different things about this, like you. George Martin wasn't alone in thinking that perhaps the Wings sidemen were not up to Paul's caliber. Linda McCartney said the same thing. You might remember when they went on the tour we referred to earlier in 1990, when she was it 60 Minutes or one of the nighttime news magazine shows where Dateline, even perhaps before it was all murder all the time. She had talked about just how much better she felt that band was than his past band. So George wasn't alone in thinking that. He had a lot of trouble taking credit for Wings breaking up, though. He argued that, and he said this to a number of his confidants and people close to him, that Paul wanted out of Wings, and he sort of laid it at George's feet. In some sense. Now, we all know Lawrence Juber from Beatles Fest, and he suggested to me, and it's in his book too, that they really thought George had a lot to do with it. A lot to do with affecting that transition. And so I tend to go with them as witnesses who had a lot to lose and a lot to gain, depending on how that particular that moment turned out after the drug bust.
Yeah, I think you wrote here that Lawrence Juber, described Paul is using George as the scapegoat for that situation.
Yeah.
You know.
But what has really impacted me more than anything I have in the book that you're holding, Tom, was our own interview with Chris Thomas, which I thought was absolutely fascinating last November when he talked about making Back to the Egg. I mean, that really sounded like a guy who was sort of wanted out of that band. And the way he began to populate it with these sort of solo pieces until they talked him out of it. That was fascinating stuff.
You know, it's interesting. Lawrence has told me before that he felt that the music Paul was writing for Tug of War didn't sound like a band album to him. It sounded more like, I don't know how you tell the difference. To some people, it's all Paul McCartney music anyway. Some people look at it that way. But in his mind, some of those songs didn't work as well as a band. You know, and maybe having studio people in there, or people like, a Carl Perkins, Stevie Wonder, Steve Gadd, those people. It was more suitable for that. So, but how did George Martin, how did he feel about the whole experience making those 3 albums?
Well, you know, when you look at those 3 records, he really doesn't have a conventional experience with them, right? I mean, most of it is making Tug of War.
Yeah.
And in a lot of ways, it's downhill from there. You know, Tug of War was the complete project. That was the one where, you know, when you follow the production schedule, they put by far the most effort into. Whereas Pipes of Peace and Broad Street were very different kinds of experiences. I mean, for the most part, right? Pipes of Peace is a few new songs, but a lot of holdovers. He has such a stockpile of material going by that point. And then, of course, by the time you get to Give My Regards to Broad Street, there are retread moments, success or failure of, I leave that up to you. But, so I, you know, before I wrote this book, the second book, I would have agreed with you that it felt like a trilogy to me, with differing results. But now it's really one experience that sort of creates aftershocks until we get to the film, which, you know, has all sorts of aesthetic problems in terms of holding it together as a single story. But there are some beautiful arrangements that we know that George can do and does well. But he always believed, you know, in creating a brand new album. And he approached most of his bands like that. Cheap Trick is a great example. Bring me all your new material. And while it didn't necessarily have the commercial expectations of their previous work, I love that record. And I think they nailed it, you know. So I don't know that I don't believe that it was particularly satisfying for him toward the end. But of course, Tug of War was, for both he and McCartney, a watershed moment. Now, if we go back to 1973, the success of Live and Let Die really helped George launch into a kind of new phase of his post-Beatles production career. And I think it's no surprise or not ironic at all that it was, you know, it was Paul that helped him get there.
Yeah. One question before I pass you over to Kit. How did George Martin feel about Paul going back and redoing the Beatles songs on Broad Street?
I had trouble finding a comment on that, to be frank with you. I was very interested in that question myself. He certainly was happy with the results, particularly with the orchestration that he was doing when they created the segues. Very happy with that material, and it is beautiful stuff. You know, I remember when me that age was listening to it. And I think I actually thought differently about it at the time. You know, it was new McCartney material as far as I was concerned, and I was happy to have it. At this juncture, I wish that we'd been getting new McCartney material in that songwriting heyday of his. You know, that's the same record with No More Lonely Nights.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, I would love to have heard him mine that terrain, or the two more rocking songs on side 2 of the record,
Sure.
which George liked a lot.
Mm-hmm.
He even liked that sort of darker version of So Bad.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Interesting.
Yeah, and that whole arrangement of Eleanor's Dream was brilliant. So that took a lot of work on
It's
George
beautiful.
Martin. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. It's beautiful stuff.
Yeah. Okay, Kit.
All right. Well, I guess we've been dwelling in the 80s right now, so let's head to the 90s. So I was curious. You know, I remember when the buzz started around anthology, and you know, I remember reading interviews with George Martin where he just said, you know, I don't understand why people want to hear these outtakes and these other, you know, why don't you just want to hear the final product? But clearly he came around. I mean, he obviously did at some point. I mean, do you think, you know, what do you think changed his mind, other than, you know, obviously it was going to be a money-making, you know, project, but what was it that finally brought him around to agreeing to work on this?
Well, it's the simple fact that, you know, slowly but surely over the decades, he had become the keeper of their legacy in a lot of ways. It happened slowly, but it happened pretty quickly, right? I mean, look at how they consulted him on the first Hollywood Bowl release. I can't believe we have to say that. Way back when, and then of course, at first they sort of quietly approach him about the CD release, and then they really pull him in. George really began to fill a legacy role with them, and it was one, of course, obviously he cared very, very much about. You can see him really in full throttle in 1993 when they re-released the Red and the Blue albums. And he and George Harrison had a nice moment together on the promotion. So it was a very natural project for him to oversee. I wish George were still alive for a number of reasons, but most certainly so that he could gauge the reaction that people are clearly having to all the outtakes we get now.
Yeah.
You know, so buckle up, buddy. You know, it's a huge marketplace. I mean, I think that they're not even tapping it as much as they could if they wanted, in terms of creating online archives of this material that you could listen to via subscription. I would subscribe today, EMI, by the way. That's just and it's a high price. I'd pay a lot every month. I'd pay a car payment. Ooh, I said it.
Ooh.
Not a big fancy SUV car payment, but a nice economy car payment. Sure.
There you go.
Yeah, absolutely. In any event, you know, the George was happy he had that level of oversight, but of course, the pain for him came with those reworkings of the John Lennon songs, and really being included out over those with this kind of cover story that his hearing wasn't up for it anymore. That was kind of sad for him.
That was one of the most shocking parts of your book when I read that, because I remember that the whole thing was that his hearing wasn't up to scratch and that he, you know, passed it over to Jeff Lynne. And I mean, I couldn't believe he wasn't asked to be a part of those sessions. So
yeah,
I mean,
well, and I had lived under that belief for a long time. I've written it incorrectly in the Beatles encyclopedia, but you can't help that. But no, it's not true. I mean, George Harrison, of course, as the story now, as we now understand it, was in financial straits, was pushing hard for the project, but wanted a certain level of control, and he wanted his guy, and his guy was Jeff Lynne.
Yeah. Yep. Understood. All right. And then there are people submitting questions here, and we may not get to them all on the air, but don't worry. We will address them, you know, keep them coming. We look at the comments as you know. So let's take a question from our good buddy, Mean Mr. Mayo. Hey, Joe. And his question is, did John come close to working with George Martin at all? I recall Lennon mentioning George's studio on WNEU in 1974.
I have no evidence that they came close to working together. George Martin probably would have done it because he truly loved them and cared for the Beatles. There's just no doubt about that. But having said that, during that period, they really were not talking. They make up a bit finally with the Hollywood Bowl. There it is again. George was passing through town. He had the new masters, dropped it off at the Dakota where John was back living by that point. And John gave them his okay, although they didn't have any kind of lengthy conversation at that point. It was later when John apologized for some of his sort of outlandish remarks during the 1970s. So I don't know if they were quite ready then. If he was going to work at a studio, it would have had to be Oxford Street because Montserrat doesn't open until, for 5 or 6 more years. But I bet he would have done it. George, loved those guys. I don't think there's much he wouldn't have done for them.
Yeah.
All right, Tom.
Yeah. Well, let's get to Live and Let Die here. I wonder if there's any kind of misconfusion on Paul's part about this, because you write that he was contacted to write the theme for Live and Let Die, not necessarily sing Live and Let Die, because as we learned by reading the book, when George Martin presents the song to Saltzman, he asks him, well, who are we going to get to sing the song? And I found it interesting that, one of the choices or one of the suggestions was Aretha Franklin. And I could totally, I would give anything to hear Aretha back then, sing a James Bond song. I thought she would be great, but was it a understanding on maybe Paul's part about, his, about his work on Live and Let Die, and it's really George Martin we had to thank for making sure that Paul sings that song, isn't it?
Isn't that crazy, that whole scenario? And I try to go back and think about it, in that period, while Paul had a few doldrums commercially speaking during the early 1970s, he's still Paul McCartney.
Right.
We haven't necessarily seen, obviously, Band on the Run and all of the things that are coming, but I found that pretty flabbergasting. The way McCartney was being sort of sidestepped during that moment in the franchise. That was a real eye opener for me. I would love. Aretha would have been very interesting. But having said that. And remember, George was fighting pretty hard for the deal because he wanted another James Bond theme, right? That was his third.
Right.
From Russia with Love, Goldfinger, and now that one. Yeah. But what a strange turn of events that it's hard to imagine a world even now where Paul would.
Yeah. But you mentioned that document that he signed in '65, where I just found it fascinating, where. Not only is it just the Beatles, but it's them individually. So that means he had to take that smaller cut of the royalties.
Right. He had to abide by the same agreement they had through January 1976.
Okay.
And they had given him a woefully small percentage, worse in the United States, in fact, which was on purpose. They made up some reasoning for it. But of course, America, as Paul McCartney says, is the biggest showbiz town ever.
Right.
The comedy, I hope, intentional in that line. But George was under a pretty crummy deal. And if you remember, that's why when he does the Yellow Submarine soundtrack in 1968, released in early 1969, he was desperate to make sure it happened, right?
Right.
If you recall, they thought for a moment about going with an EP of just the Beatles music, and George said, now, wait a minute. You're not denying me this. This thing's going to shoot. I'm ready to get paid, and he was, and he deserved it.
Anything at all that you learned about the Flaming Pie sessions and the work that George Martin did there, because he did the orchestration on Some Days and also on Beautiful Night. What was it like that later in his career to be working with Paul?
He saw those, I don't want to say as work for hire, but, for George Martin by that point, this stuff was rote. All you had to do, quite frankly, was send him the demo And he would go into his, I mean, by this point, of course, he's living in his fabulous estate, but he would go into his music room and, he could bang something like that out. For him, that period was marked by the fact that Linda was dying, and that was very painful. I mean, if you imagine by that point how long he has known and been close to Linda, they were all just devastated by where that was going.
Sure. Yeah.
So his memories, and I give him great credit for this, by the way. When you look at his memories, they're so often connected less to the particular project and more to the people. He really did love the people. That was to him, the connection was the folks. And he, he was a giant of a man in more ways than one, very complex, but he really did have a huge heart for anybody he worked with. He would remember them years later. I talked to several folks who worked in recording studios with him at different times in his life, and how they would run into each other in somewhere in London or the United States, and they would go to dinner and they would just have these really personal times. A couple of them even would tell me all sorts of information about working on the sessions, but then I'd say, well, tell me about what'd you guys do at dinner, and they'd be like, they all said a very similar thing. That was kind of personal. That was their thing. Even John Kurlander talking about after 9/11. When they had a moment just thinking about the devastation together. They really were very proud of their intimate experiences with him and would keep those quiet.
Okay. We're almost out of time. I do want to just mention something here, because Jeff Emerick is a name we bring up every now and then, and it just seems like, certainly in Paul's solo career, Jeff Emerick was very involved with engineering many of his albums, and it always seems like where there's George Martin, there's Jeff Emerick. Was there this incredible bond between the two of them? How do you describe their relationship?
They did have a great bond, and of course, Jeff would execute so many of George's best innovations, right? And Jeff would often make them better. Would make them, wow, this is not a word, folks, so don't write this down, but he would make them innovativer, right? No, I mean, he would. Jeff was wonderful in that way. And they were, it's amazing. You're exactly right. They would almost be a two-person deal, right? But by the dawn of this century, unfortunately, they sort of went their own ways. And George was very troubled by Jeff's book. He said much of it was fiction.
Really?
And anybody who writes about the Beatles gets some great material out of that book, because it's a firsthand experience, but you have to be very careful with it, right? And weigh the validity of some of the stories and double check them because of a faulty memory or a faulty co-writer's memory or whatever happened there. I couldn't tell you. And sadly, we can't ask Jeff now, but they had some tough feelings. And Jeff, while helpful for both of these books, would not comment on some things when he felt that he would be saying something negative about George in retrospect. Okay. So in a way, he honored his memory in that way. But that was a complex relationship. I don't know, and this was something I was going to ask Jeff about, how they left things.
Yeah.
I couldn't tell you. But obviously, they were the brain trust behind some of the greatest recordings in the history of the world.
Well put. Yeah. He's very protective of George.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have one last question, then we'll just go around with everybody else. Did George ever say what his proudest moment was after the Beatles? Of all the artists,
I didn't hear that one.
Did George Martin ever say what his proudest moment was that he achieved after the Beatles? Even if that includes solo Beatles with Paul McCartney. Did he ever comment on what he was most proud of?
If you did a sort of a study of his mentions, I think it's probably working with Jeff Beck. I mean, that's a great record. He really hits everything. There are no bad notes on that record. His orchestration merging with Beck's guitar work is pretty stunning. And he felt really enlarged by that. Tug of War was huge too, but the Jeff Beck album, I think, would have been up there for him, even though it wasn't necessarily his greatest work, and he certainly leaned, understandably, on Giles. As a Briton, the moment with Princess Diana was he felt a great patriotism about being part of that. The loss of George Harrison was heartbreaking for him, and he felt very close. He was very proud of his work on Love, particularly on his last recording ever, which is While My Guitar Gently Weeps. That's just beautiful stuff, and there are a lot of highlights. If I could talk to George, and by the time I was working on this, he really was not able to have the kind of conversations I would need, and his team was very kind, but he was unavailable. I would underscore the biggest thing he's given to pop music that still exists today, and that is his emergence. He blew pop music wide open. He created an unparalleled demographic for popular music. It was not just the music of teeny boppers when George Martin was done with it. The Beatles, I would never take anything away from their songwriting, which, changed my life, like all of yours. But he's the guy who took it from a narrow demographic to the whole world, to 4-year-olds and 94-year-olds. And that happened in 1965, 66, 67. It is unparalleled what happens in that period when he helps them to enlarge their sound and take it to arguably every demographic. They go from the teeny boppers to every demographic, and George doesn't just open that door for them. Look at what happens beyond that, right? Right. You can hear him in country and western, the Eagles. I could go on, right? I mean, it's absolutely everywhere.
I couldn't have said it better.
That's right.
Kit, any last questions?
Just that, I thought it was interesting when you mentioned Love, because I know that was something that he and Jeff Emmerich disagreed on. You mentioned that in your book, and I don't know if Jeff ever came around, but it seemed like that was as you just mentioned, the last sort of satisfying project George did. I mean, he seemed, as you said, just seemed so proud of it, and willing to take his creations and the productions, I should say, and turn them into something else, and did a wonderful job.
Well, to be fair, he gave a lot of that credit to Giles.
True.
George was in the hospital when that project started. When I discussed it with Giles, he sort of suggested that maybe George's heart was not in that, didn't quite believe you could do it. But then I think, like all of us, he discovered very quickly when he heard it, wow, of course you can. The Beatles are that elastic. Of course you can create new layers of these amazing layers that we already have. And he was in heart and soul by the time he got out of the hospital. So it was a really great moment for them. I don't think Jeff ever changed his mind about Love. The last time I talked to him, he brought it up. and in the book, I think I have it in all its ferociousness.
I think, you do.
Jeff really felt like that music's sacrosanct, right? You don't touch it. To me, and I'm of a different generation like you, I hear it and I think, it's not sacrosanct. It's so good that you can rend it into different kinds of experience, right?
Right.
And that's why it's so fabulous. Now, ultimately, this happens to me every time. I'm running back to the original at some point just because it did have a pristine quality to it. But, those pieces on Love are just amazing. And they make your heart sing. But that doesn't mean you don't love the original.
There is a talent that comes with blending 2 or 3 songs together, hearing them in your head, how they could work. That is an art to itself. Yeah.
Right. And the drama, right? the drama in works like my favorite one is the Mr. Kite, where it's merged with, what is it, Helter Skelter and something else. Yeah, but it's just beautiful. The horses slowed down and neighing. It is dark, and Giles finds different textures and moods inside those songs. I love that. Right. Just his presentation of because, right? You strip away actually his father playing the keyboards. You strip that away, and it's almost a different song. It's no less beautiful. It's just beautiful in a different way.
True.
Absolutely.
Okay. Tom, how about you?
Yeah, I want to talk about Sgt. Pepper for a second, but not the good one, the bad one.
Ouch. Yeah, you were asking about that earlier too.
Listen, I've never really paid much attention to it. There is some good stuff in there, but I was kind of shocked on how personal he took the job. Where he's saying that I couldn't bear to see anybody else, take on that project, and then also him saying that he shouldn't have done it. So I was kind of surprised, his feelings, and where he almost blamed himself for the poor success of the soundtrack. It doesn't sound like that was something that he was really wanted to do in the first place, but you also wrote that he got a nice fee for it, so why not do it?
Yeah, he absolutely wanted to do it, and it was maybe arguably the biggest payday of his career. It was enormous money that came his way courtesy of the Stigwood organization. Right. It was absolutely massive dollars, and he put a lot. And of course by his side was Jeff Emmerich. They spent they moved to LA to work on that project. I was fortunate to be able to talk to some of the folks who were part of the engineering team, and and I think I included this scene in the book. It was so long they cut some of it, so I apologize if you think things are missing. It's not because I didn't know. And by the way, it's coming out in paperback this fall, and they wouldn't let me enlarge it. In any event, that's another fight for another time. But but going back to that Sgt. Pepper experience, there's that great scene where he and Jeff would listen to it without the vocals because they really loved what they pulled together with the instrumentation and the orchestration. The vocals added to it in many cases. But then the screenplay was just, I would caution George, again, if I'm dead, that there's nothing he can do to resuscitate that screenplay. It's a jukebox musical, but so is the movie we just talked about, right? And there's a big difference in terms of the quality of story.
Yes.
That story did not work for audiences, back then. It was highly problematic. And you can compare it to Across the Universe, where maybe something more plausible, I would argue, occurred in terms of creating a jukebox musical out of the Beatles music. So I don't know if there's anything he could have done about that. But he certainly beats himself up for it. But of course, it was painful if you were watching Billboard magazine in those years. And, the thing came out with a flourish, and then, and we all remember this is going to date us, but remember the cutouts in the corner of the record, right? And all those records. What was the line about it? It was the first album to be ever returned double platinum.
Yeah, double platinum. Yeah.
That was hurtful.
They shipped like 4 million copies, I think, like that.
Yeah, and of course, Robin Gibb who was out there saying that you're going to forget the original songs after you hear this.
Well, I don't mind his vocals on "Oh Darling." I think that's one of the, better aspects of that album. But one more quick little question, and you don't have to go in too much specifics. But Solid State coming up, your newest book coming up later this year. Did you learn anything more about George that you didn't find out about him during this part 2 of the bio?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I've got a few tidbits in there for you.
Okay.
Yeah, I got them from subsequent conversations with several of the parties we've discussed tonight, where I learned a bit more about his perspective. You know,
I'm sensing
just
this
floating in and
your
out of
show.
that.
I think it
Could be,
is.
although Abbey Road's not a solo record as far as I know.
That's true. It's our darn show. We can do what we want.
We could bend the rules a little bit.
We can bend the rules.
Okay. Well, this has been great. And just like so many topics that we tackle here, we could do several shows on this because the contributions of George Martin, as Ken so eloquently put it, are just so enormous. And there's a lot we didn't even talk about still with the solo music. So maybe we'll revisit this in a future show.
Right.
And yes, it wouldn't be complete without Ken's cat. So there you go.
That's true.
For those there are fans out there, I know we wouldn't leave you hanging without seeing at least one of the cats.
So very quickly, let's give our folks some contact information about us and what we're all doing in our latest projects. Kit, how about you first?
Well, Deep Beatles is finally coming back this week. I had to take an unplanned hiatus last month, but it is back. It'll be up this week at Something Else Reviews. I was on an episode of a podcast that was a friend of our show when they was Fab. I was on a two-parter there. There was that. And then the first part of a two-part interview I did for another great podcast, Glass Onion, is also up. Those links are all on my Facebook page, and you can find that. You can also go to kidotool.com or follow me on Twitter at kidotool, and I will give you all the links to these various projects.
Okay. Ken Womack, how about you?
Oh, I try to stay busy, Ken. Between petting cats and
that's a very important job.
And feeding cats. You can read all about my work at kennethwomack.com. Just gearing up for the story of Solid State and the end of the Beatles at the end of this year. I was very fortunate to get a very nice review in Publishers Weekly.
Yeah. Congratulations.
It's a great start for the book, and I'm gearing up to do some, hopefully some talks this fall in big cities like New York. I'm waiting, of course, for Kit to invite me to Chicago. She never does.
You're coming to Fest next month.
Yeah, but I mean in the fall. Like when there's a nip in the air, when you and I are down on that Navy pier, just soaking in all that good Chicago fun. You know the place, Kit.
I know. I hear you. I gotcha.
Okay, Tom, how about you? What's going on with you?
Well, you can find me, just myself, Tom Hunyady, on Facebook. You can also check out my other show, Two Legs. Just on the Facebook page, we just posted our season finale. That's our third season finale, actually, where we had a special guest, Mitchell Axelrod, joined us. And we very politely discussed some of Paul's missteps throughout his solo career. So, we weren't too negative. We were pretty positive, give some constructive criticism on some of the stuff we thought maybe he shouldn't have done, so we had a good time with that. You can go to podbean.com and check that out. You can email me at twolegspodcast@gmail.com. And we'll be back in September or October for season 4.
Wow. All right. Very good. You're a busy man right there.
Yeah.
And as for me, my email address is everylittlething@att.net. I also have a Facebook page under Ken Michaels. You can visit my website, kenmichaelsradio.com, for lots of Beatle interviews, including with Kit and with Ken. They're on the website. Beatles trivia page every single week where you can win one of 9 great prizes. And also, I did a recent interview with Terry Crane. Terry is the author of this book right here, Nems and the Business of Selling Beatles Merchandise in the United States, 1964 to 1966. It's all about all the items that were sold here. It's not a price guide, but it's all the background information, who the manufacturer was, photos of all the items, really detailed book. And as a matter of fact, Terry was a guest We recorded it today for Things We Said Today, which is our next show, which will be out probably this Thursday on podbean.com, also on YouTube. And also, I should say that if you ever want to hear my syndicated Beatles show called Every Little Thing, there is one website out of Germany. I wonder why.
Wow.
Where you can hear archived shows of Every Little Thing. You can just stream them whenever you want. And that's at globaltexanchronicles.com. It's a long name, but it's worth investigating. globaltexanchronicles.com. I think that about does it for us. Ken, this has been wonderful, and we got to have more conversation about George Martin. And don't forget the book, Sound Pictures, and the previous book, Maximum Volume on George Martin. And this has been wonderful. So
thanks, team. I really enjoyed it.
It was fun.
Yep.
Thank you.
So for Tom and Ken and Kit, I'm Ken Michaels, thanking all of you for joining us. And we will see you next time.